Okay, in this video, I'm just going to cover a real quick look at the main part that you need for this part of the lab. It's very similar to the last one you did. The only difference, or the main logical difference, is instead of pulling all of the products from the table, what you have to do is you have to pull products based on which customer was selected. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through the code for a join using the last example that we have with our titles and author example. So it's a little different, and I'll talk you through this example, and then I'll tell you the differences between this example and your lab that you need to turn in on Sunday. To give you some little tips on where to go. So in my example here, I'm doing an author search, and so I'm going to search my database by author's last name, but instead of just pulling data from the author table, I also want to pull and display data from the titles table. So assuming there's a form somewhere that has a field named author that I can type in the last name, Patterson or something like that, I'm receiving that through the filter input, and I'm going to store it in a variable named author search. So I'm going to use that in my query to pull records from my database where the author ID of the author that I've selected matches a foreign key field in the titles table that ties it to the author. So this is pretty similar to what you'll be doing in your query, and I'll come back and talk about it more specifically. So we have our normal query statement. Now we have a little bit of a different kind of way to identify our fields in our select. And the rule of thumb is if there are two fields that are named the same thing across your tables, then you need to identify them with the name of the table and then dot the field ID. So for example, in this make-believe database, in the titles table, we probably have a foreign key field named author ID that allows us to tie the name of the title to the actual author who lives in another table. So this really is not necessary because there's only one book ID across these, but I wrote it out just to show you that this right here is indicating the table that it's coming from and then the field that it is retrieving. So we're going to retrieve the book ID from the titles table, the book title from the titles table. We're going to get the author's first name from the author table and the author's last name from the author table. So here's where we have our join information, and what we need to do is we need to tell it to go and grab these things from the titles table, but before you do that, match up those foreign keys using an inner join on the author table. And so we don't want all of the titles in the database, we don't want all the authors in the database, we want to join those two tables together and only retrieve the fields where there is a corresponding author record for the title record. And so what we do is we tell it we want to do an inner join, which will limit that to only matching records. And then we have to tell it how to join those two tables. So we're going to tell it in the titles table there is a field named author ID, and we only want to retrieve the records where it matches up with the author ID in the author field. And that right there is how we're tying those two tables together. So you're going to have a similar inner join on the two tables that you need for this example. And then once that intermediary record set, we'll say, is created, then we can whittle that down with our criteria for which records we actually want. And so in this case, we're going to say we want the matching records where the author's last name and the author table equals our search term. So we have our placeholder here, and then we go down here as usual. We bind what's stored in our, whoops, I have an error. This should be author underscore search. See, I also have to make my field names match up sometimes, after the fact. So we have what they searched for stored in our variable that came from our input filter, binding that to our placeholder in our SQL query. And when we execute that, it creates a record set using fetch all like we normally do. So again, the code we had from the last time I did this example, we still can loop through the same record set we have, but now this time, instead of just having information available to us about the title, we also have corresponding information available to us from the author table that we selected. So what you're going to do is just a little bit different. In your example, what they're going to do is on your initial form, somebody's going to search for the customer that they're looking for, and they're searching by email. So remember that you can do a fetch there instead of a fetch all. So in this example, before this, in your lab, you'll have another SQL statement here to select the customer. So once you fetch that, just like we did in the last lab, once you fetch that, what I would recommend is go ahead and set up a variable. So do something like customer ID and set that equal to whatever your result was. So customer, customer, I can't remember the field names. I think it's customer ID. So what you'll do is out of the record, once you retrieve the customer, go ahead and dump their customer ID directly into a variable right here, because when you come to do your second one, you're going to say select from your customer table. You're going to inner join it on the registrations table. And so you'll find the two fields that match up between those two tables. And here you'll be able to just where the customer is the variable that you've saved. So this is pretty much the structure you'll use, but of course part of what you're going to have to do for the lab is figure out how it works with the tables that are involved. But a quick step what you can do is when you first execute the statement here to select which customer you're working with, so it retrieves Bart Simpson, go ahead and store Bart Simpson's customer ID in a new variable. And then that way what you can do is you can use that variable like you're used to using down here in your where statement and in your bind value. And pretty much what that'll do is it'll allow them to search for a customer. It'll allow them to retrieve which products are registered to that customer, and then you'll go through a normal for each loop down here in your drop down menu like you did on the last lab. After that, you'll just do an insert statement for the incident and you should be good to go. So I'm not sure there's really anything for me to post in there. If you need more information on the join statement, let me look up the number for the book. I think it's around 100, 101, somewhere in there. Let me see. Yeah, if you look at the code on page 104 and 105, it walks you through the idea of the join statement. So there's an example there that's just as good as this example here. So I would refer you to that. So this time you get a video, but no notes really worth posting on this. So if you have questions, let me know.